listening to the Recovering Methodism Podcast, a global Methodist voice for navigating life and ministry in the 21st century, tackling the issues impacting the church, and recovering the distinctly Methodist practices to participate in the next Great Awakening. And now your hosts, David Cady and Caleb Spiker.
Andy's back again. Katie's back. Tell a friend. Katie's back. Katie's back. Katie's back. Katie's back. I am too.
That sounds vaguely familiar, but I'm not even going to go there, Caleb. But it's good to be back, I tell you that much. And back here with our podcast, Recovering Methodism. And today we got a big idea to talk about, a book to talk about from Caleb's library. And I think a good conversation for our toolbox today. So why don't you just let folks know what our big idea is today?
Yeah, today the big idea is how to lament together in the church. What lament is, and how that can be a healthy part of the life of a local church.
So lamenting is one of those concepts that obviously it's biblical, right? There's a whole book in the Bible called Lamentations.
And a third of the Psalms.
A third of the Psalms are somewhat not upbeat, right?
Yes.
So you think of lamenting, it's like, well, that's a downer, right?
Yeah.
No one wants to lament. So today we're going to talk about this concept of lamenting as a very necessary, healthy thing to do in an individual's life, in a congregation's life, as we, I guess, acknowledge that sometimes things aren't bright and cheery, right?
Yeah, I think lament is one of those ways that we truly live lives of confession before God. Confession being not just apologizing, but truth-telling, being willing to bear our souls before the Lord and honestly say, this is not what I hoped it would be, and this the way that I feel right now is not in line with the way I have experienced you historically and the promises that you make in Scripture.
So basically what we're talking about today is giving permission to feel bad.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right? Because oftentimes people feel this pressure, especially in the church, I think, even pastors, right, to say on a Sunday morning or whenever, hey, no, things are fine. I'm doing fine. Good to see you too. Things are good. Yeah.
Living the dream.
Living the dream. Yeah, you hear that all the time, and it drips with sarcasm, right?
Yep.
How are things? Living the dream. It's like, really, I don't know that that's really what you're trying to say.
Yeah,
there.
I mean, it's the dream where I'm being chased by a clown with a chainsaw, but it is a dream.
Living the nightmare. So lament, the process of lamenting, being a biblical concept that seems to have been somewhat lost, I think, in the modern practice of Christianity, at least in the Western world, perhaps is something that can be recovered, right? And then when we get into the toolbox, maybe we'll talk about some deeper ways that can be done in the life of the church. But maybe we should just touch on this right now. Why would a congregation want to go into a season of lament?
I think the big reason is just that life is hard, right? Like there are lamentable things that happen. Mm-hmm. And I think, part of what we see both in the biblical narrative and in just the lives that we've lived, is that on the backside of these seasons, oftentimes there's some clarity about how God's going to use this painful, lamentable season. Mm-hmm. But even in those times that it feels almost like wasted suffering, the process of lament helps us come near to God and to rest in His presence. Even if we are resting in His presence in a bitter, salty mood, we still are able to experience the presence of God and abide in Him in this practice of lament.
That's good. I like that. Now, my understanding from at least some of the Psalms, many of the Psalms that touch on this concept of lamenting, there's this period in the Psalms where things aren't going well at all, right? But by the end of the psalm, the psalmist turns the attention toward God's goodness and faithfulness. Is that an accurate description of the process? In other words, you don't leave yourself, you don't leave the congregation in the cesspool of bitterness and bad feelings. You recognize it, admit it, right? Identify it, confess it, but you come back to the realization of God's faithfulness to you even in those moments. Is that accurate?
Yeah, there are 4 movements to lament that we see in the Psalms, right? Okay. So the first movement is turning away from your internal sort of dialogue and pain and navel gazing and turning towards God, right? Like you cannot lament at your own navel. Like there has to be a turn towards God. You are addressing God with this lament.
Okay.
And once you've turned towards God, like God is big and strong and can handle your complaint. You cannot take out that piece of lament that is complaint. That, this thing that I'm experiencing, this thing that I'm seeing, this thing that has happened, it sucks. I do not like it. This is not okay. And that leads into this place of remembering the character of God, and being clear with God. It's like I believe that you are loving, but I do not feel loved. I believe that you are good, but this feels incredibly unfair. I believe that you are a God of justice, but this feels very much unjust. And then that final piece in the fourth movement of lament is to choose to trust that God is who He says He is. That whatever is going on right now, you haven't gotten to the end of that experience. And that God is going to come through, and God is going to prove Himself trustworthy, and God is going to prove Himself good, and God is going to prove Himself loving. And the psalm that I continue to go back to, because it's the one that in our tradition as Christians we spend the most time talking about at least once a year, is Psalm 22.
Right.
Psalm 22, it begins, my God, why have you forsaken me? The words of Jesus on the cross.
Yep.
Right? Like He is leading His disciples and those who are gathered around in worship from the cross. It's like this is this is the moment when this psalm that our people have sang for 2,000 years is most appropriate. And as we know, Psalm 22, it doesn't end with the forsakenness of God, but rather God's trustworthiness and God's goodness, goodness that you will tell for generations to come.
Right.
And in the middle of it, the complaint gets even more complainy, and the recognition of who God has been historically is there, and then finally it's that choice to trust that even in this time where I feel forsaken, where I feel forgotten, I know that on the backside of it, you're going to be trustworthy. You're going to be present,
right.
And we will tell of this for generations to come. So
as you share that, I'm just reflecting on the liturgical life of the church, my own devotional life, where I see others as well. We often find ourselves in two extremes in that process. Either we focus, like, for example, on Good Friday, Psalm 22 is read, and we know Jesus quotes these words from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? And we stop there, right? And even in our personal lives, I've seen it in other people, we stop in the wallowing of the bitterness and the pain and the loneliness of life, and we don't focus on the goodness of God and the promise of God and the hope that God has a better future in store for us. The other extreme is we read the parts of the Psalms that talk about God's faithfulness and God's good. His love endures forever, and we skip the other part of the lamenting.
That's right.
Right?
That's right. Yep.
And we do that in our own lives.
Mm-hmm.
And what I guess the connection I'm putting here based on our conversation is that maybe a healthier approach, a biblical approach, is to combine the two extremes, if you will, and not necessarily call them extremes, just call it life.
Yep.
Right? And understanding that we have this opportunity to lament in the realities of our lives, whether it be for a season or for a lengthier period of time, but all the while being reminded of God's goodness and faithfulness, that His steadfast love endures forever, even in the midst of our pain and suffering.
Yeah, and I think that that lament it really follows an ancient and time-tested and valuable sort of flow of worship, where you begin with creation, you go through fall and talk about redemption, and then the consummation and the good thing to come. I've sometimes wondered, what would it look like to set up the sort of liturgical life on a Sunday morning, so that it follows that flow, right? Like especially on like a communion Sunday, right? Like what better way to affirm your trust that God is going to ultimately bring justice and ultimately bring goodness than coming to the table and receiving the body and the blood of Christ. And I think about especially at times when really tough community things happen.
Yeah.
We've gotten so used to sort of the American model of church where lament doesn't really have a place. Good luck finding the hymn you want in the hymn book. And even harder, good luck finding something on K-Love that is going to satisfy that deep recognition that something isn't right, because it's not marketable to be sad.
It is not. And you mentioned, we'll just say, contemporary Christian radio, which markets itself as positive and uplifting and encouraging.
Yeah.
And that often spills over to our consumer mindset to church life. And I don't come to church to feel bad concept,
Yep.
right? Now the reality is I feel bad, and I don't know.
Can't church be escapism? Please?
Well, see, that's part of the issue here. Now, the irony here is, as we record this, this podcast will probably drop the week of Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Right, kicking off a 5 to 6 week period of holiday cheer. Right.
For some people.
Well, that's part of the issue. Is you can't escape the secularism of holidays. Turn on the radio. Just about every radio station is going to be Christian music, and
Mariah Carey has woken up from her hibernation.
Yes, she has. Yes, she has. I drive,
and she's angry.
I drive past the zoo lights every night on my way home from work, and so it's a festive time of year, and rightly so. Right? Yeah. We're not saying it should not be festive. However, not everybody is going to have a holly jolly Christmas.
That's true.
And I think the church needs to be sensitive to that to a certain degree. So I'm wondering, you mentioned this concept of structuring a worship service around this concept of lament. And we know clearly there have been patterns of Christmas type of services that focus, Blue Christmas, Longest Night service, so on and so forth, that focus on the reality that there are folks that are grieving and going through a difficult time, who are lonely, and this may not be a time of year that they look forward to.
Yep.
Right? But congregationally, is Lent a good time to focus on lamenting? As a season of the church, right? And to structure worship services around the season of Lent, whatever that 6 weeks or whatever that is, 6-7 weeks of Lent, that culminate with Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday and all of Holy Week. I don't know. It's just something I'm thinking out loud here. Would love to hear from some of the listeners maybe that have some ideas around that. The email address again is?
Yeah, it's recoveringmethodism@gmail.com.
All right. So
yeah, I'd especially be interested because I know we have some friends who may be listening who, the liturgical life of the church is really their bread and butter and the place that gets them excited. So hearing from them would be especially exciting.
Yeah. But I think you're right on target when you say that lamenting is not quite marketable in the American church anyway, yet very necessary. I just think that there are a lot of folks that are struggling with things and they're unable to name it, right? Unable to get past it, and maybe perhaps have tried to ignore it. And lamenting, a worship time around lament, may be just the very thing that helps them express things that have been inexpressible for them, and that brings them back to the promises of God and help them to find some way to work through that season.
Yeah, I would go so far as to say, like, the lack of, holy complaint resources is so thin. We almost have to borrow something from the secular culture around us to even provide something complaint worthy, right? Like there will be a Taylor Swift breakup song.
Wow.
Rage Against the Machine,
9 Inch Nails.
I
got you.
Yeah, who in the contemporary Christian music space is offering?
I think you and I have talked about this. Johnny Cash's rendition of Hurt?
Oh,
I mean, it is.
What have I become?
It just drips. Yeah. It drips of realism and lament, right?
So part of my Lenten practice last year was I listened to that song during my devotions every day.
Well,
because
Did you find it helpful?
It did center me in the reality of the brokenness that Lent reminds us of. I think some of the own challenges in my world at that season too.
Sure.
There was a certain catharsis to, recognizing that, there's just a level of brokenness that we cannot escape in this life.
Well, I suspect that as we head into 2024, with the things that currently are going on in the world, the geopolitical landscape of things happening in Israel and Palestine, and the economy still is what the economy has been for quite a number of years now, and as things ramp back up for COVID, and whatever else lies ahead for us, that this might be something that just might benefit the local church in putting into practice in very real and practical ways. Again, not just, as you said, navel-gazing and complaining about life in general, but naming those things that are causing us struggle and pain or seasons we're stuck in, and circling back around to the promises of God, His faithfulness to us.
And I think for the Christian, that's the big part of the challenge, is when the circumstance of our lives leads us to call into question whether what God has said about Himself is true.
Yeah.
So being able to name the stuff that's broken and to intentionally put our foot in the ground and say, I'm not going to let the circumstances determine what I choose to believe is true. I'm going to choose to trust You.
I like that. Well, that's good conversation, and we're going to transition to, I'm looking forward to the book you're going to share with us from Caleb's library.
it's time for Caleb's Library.
All right, we are back for our segment we call Caleb's Library. And we got a book today to talk about that looks very, very interesting. You can't see it, obviously, on the podcast, but I love the cover design. And the title is Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy. And tell us, Caleb, who wrote this book?
Yeah, so Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy was written by Mark Vroegrop. He's a pastor in Indianapolis. And part of the Gospel Coalition. So he's more reformed than we are, and his reformed theology is front and center in this book.
All right,
which is okay.
Yeah, I would just say
we don't hold it against him.
Most people are more reformed than we are, right?
That's true.
Because you're not going to find too many people in our circles that are strongly reformed. But it's good to get a view of his topic here, which is lamenting, right?
Yep.
And so the subtitle of the book is
Discovering the Grace of Lament.
Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy, Discovering the Grace of Lament. So walk us through where Pastor Mark takes us in the book.
So for him, this journey began when he and his wife lost a pregnancy. It was one of those full-term stillbirth, incredibly painful. A lot of questions as to why and how and what's the point. And,
that's only natural.
Yeah. And it led him to a deep dive into these Psalms of Lament, and learning that rhythm of lament, the turn and complain, and remember God's character and choose to trust it. So the first half of the book is just talking about what lament is, looking at the Psalms of Lament, and then the middle section of the book is talking about the Book of Lamentations. This super lament written by Jeremiah, there right in the middle of the Old Testament, and taking an especially deep look at the center of the book, Lamentations chapter 3. Because one of the things that we don't see in our English translations is that Lamentations is an acrostic. All right, so every chapter of Lamentations, the lamentation is written with one lamentation that begins with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet.
Right.
So, in English it would be a lamentation by Jeremiah because Jerusalem has been destroyed by those no good Assyrians. 'Cause we were unfaithful to God, but despite, yeah, exactly.
I got you. So A, B, C, D,
yeah.
But in the Hebrew alphabet.
But in the Hebrew alphabet.
So the first part of Lamentations is an acrostic.
The entire book is.
The entire book.
So each chapter is its own acrostic, except chapter 3 is a triple acrostic.
So that's where I was going with this.
So it's AAA, BBB, CCC, DDD, but with the Hebrew alphabet that I don't know because I went to United in the early 2010s when languages was not an emphasis.
Understand. So chapter 3 in Lamentations is probably the most familiar part of Lamentations, right? Mm-hmm. That's where we have, great is thy faithfulness, right?
Yeah.
Mercies are new every morning.
Which is a wild statement for Jeremiah to be making as he's watching the temple burn.
Yeah, so the understanding that the context of Lamentations is, the Assyrians have sacked Jerusalem, everything's being destroyed, people are being killed, the temple is being burned right in front of him, right?
Yep.
And this is his response, right? In the middle of that, in the middle of the lamentation is this wonderful, very memorable concept of God's faithfulness to us, right?
Yep.
Your mercies are new every morning. Right. Which is, I mean, you take a poll of most church folk, most Christian, that's the part of Lamentations we focus on.
That's right.
I like that part.
Who doesn't?
Right. So,
Which, isn't it interesting that as the church, the part of Lamentations that we, remember and we focus on is the "Your grace is new every morning"
right.
part.
Well, that tells a lot about us.
Yep,
right?
sure does.
And it clearly says a lot about God. First of all, that His mercy is and His grace is smack dab in the middle of our challenges and problems and failures and meltdowns. He's right there in the middle of it.
Yeah.
But it does say a lot about us that we want to focus on that part and not go through the hard work of lamenting, which we talked about in the previous segment. So, Pastor Mark, I'm not going to try to pronounce the last name. It's spelled Vroegop, Vroegrop?
Something like that.
Okay. Pastor Mark, right? How does he take it? How does the book end? We've talked about where does he get to?
Yeah, so the final section, it's all about application, right? It's how do you live with lament. Because he recognizes that just because you lament once doesn't mean everything's fine now.
Oh, my goodness, yes.
Right?
Right.
That for some things in our lives, that lament will be a long, long process.
Right.
So how do we live faithfully, when we, walk past that empty bedroom and all we can say is, "How long, O Lord?" Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, there's a lot of really helpful pieces in here, and I think sometimes in the Wesleyan tradition, we have gone too far into the ditch of everything that you interpret as bad in your life. That's not God's plan. It's that's part of the brokenness of the world, but God will figure out a way to fix it. But like this past week, we were in the story of Joseph, and Joseph makes it really clear to his brothers, right? Like, you sold me into slavery, and that's exactly what God wants you to do, because it became a blessing for me. Mm-hmm. God needed me here in this place, in this time, and I wouldn't have gotten here if you guys hadn't sold me to slavery. So don't beat yourselves up about it.
So you mentioned that Pastor Mark is coming from a Reformed perspective. All right, let's just take that example of Joseph. How would, I don't know if Mark goes into it in the book, but how does he interpret these kind of things that people go through? Does he just resolve it and say, well, that's God's plan? Or
mostly, yeah. I mean, it's largely a determinist mindset, right? That God has a plan, and that plan is going to work out, and part of that plan is really painful at the time, but we can trust that God is good, and even in that pain, on the backside, there will be a blessing. Okay.
Let's just have a moment of conversation from we'll say a Wesleyan Arminian kind of perspective, a non-Reformed theology. How might that be different in approaching the problems and difficulties of life? Because I think, I'll just say it this way. Oftentimes, in my experience, no matter if someone's been quote-unquote Methodist all their life, they become very Reformed during times of tragedy.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. And so what might be a more authentic Wesleyan, Arminian, Methodist approach to suffering and struggle, theodicy, if you will, the problem of evil, that may be different from, well, it's all part of God's plan. I don't know how it'll work out, but it will. So how might that be different?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think we start from a different place, right? So, my experience with the Reformed tradition is that it starts from the fall, and there isn't that deep recognition that the brokenness of this world is not by design. Which I think is, as Wesleyans, we say, like, everything broken in the world, like, it wasn't supposed to be this way.
Right. So before original sin in Genesis 3, there was original blessing in Genesis 1. Right? And so what you're saying is we maybe want to take a step further back and say, yeah, things are broken now, but it was never always like this.
Yeah.
Is that what you're going for here? Mm-hmm. Okay. Didn't mean to interrupt you, but go ahead.
Yeah. So I think that's kind of we start from a different spot, and then we do weave our chords together, right? Like we are, we are a Christian tradition that is fully cognizant of sin, and that sin is inescapable, and that death is inescapable. And I think part of especially the sort of postmodern American Methodist picture, because like you don't get this from Wesley, because Wesley lived at a time where there were still parts of England that didn't have clean drinking water.
Right.
Like there were still communities where food was not cheap.
Right.
There were still plenty of people who, couldn't afford medical care, and medical care wasn't even accessible. And the medical care you got wasn't that good, largely because Wesley was administering it. Right.
Right.
So, for us, like, because we live in, an age of miracle and wonder, where water is clean, where food is cheap, where medical care is accessible, we can easily believe this narrative that says we are entitled to a certain amount of ease and comfort and safety in this life, which is something that, in 18th century England would not have been an assumption, and surely was an assumption for anyone who wrote in the Bible.
And I would just add, it's not an assumption for the majority of people who live on the planet today.
Oh, undoubtedly.
Right.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So, because we as Americans have this assumption around safety and health and comfort, when our safety, our health, or our comfort becomes insecure in any way, we can have a response that is very abnormal in the history of humanity. And I think as postmodern American Methodists, we can attribute some challenges in our life to unfairness in the cosmos that is really kind of comes across as entitled, petulant children complaining about nonsense. So, and I think this is part of where, especially as global Methodists, we, are blessed by the presence of our brothers and sisters around the world who can look at us when we're complaining about our appointments and go, so you mean the militia isn't trying to burn down your village?
It's true.
Man, rough life you have. And where, as here in the wider evangelical movement in America, we can, be blessed by our Reformed brothers and sisters being like, this time of hardship in your life isn't going to kill you. Maybe God is using it and even brought it on to get you to the next place where you can abide more closely with Him, or you can bless other people.
Sure, absolutely.
So, I think there's a real a benefit for us in global Methodism, especially in this next season of, keeping our mouths shut and listening to the people around us when it comes to why challenges arise.
Right.
And we may just learn, one, that our challenges are superficial by comparison, and that if we are willing to rest in the tension of God may be behind this because there's something better around the corner that I would not have embraced had I not been into this discomforting situation. I think there's real wisdom in that this coming season.
I think there is too. So the title of the book is Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy, Discovering the Grace of Lament by Mark Vroegrop.
Yep.
So recommend the book?
Yeah, I do. There, like I said, there are some pieces that are just very reformed and take it further than we would. Then as a a Wesleyan person, I'm comfortable with. But by and large, I think it's well written and helpful, and can really be a helpful corrective to some of the postmodern American Methodist assumptions about hardship.
All right. Well, thank you. This is a good addition to Caleb's library and a conversation around a book that maybe a lot of folks hadn't heard about. So thank you for bringing it to our attention.
Now for some practical wisdom for church leaders. Let's open up the pastor's toolbox.
Dave, I was wondering about the toolbox. We've talked about funerals, and we've talked about preaching and discipleship and leadership development.
Right.
And I kind of wish we would have gone back and said, like, in the toolbox of ministry, this is your hammer, this is your screwdriver, this is your because I think what we're talking about today, it's like the X-Acto knife in the toolbox.
Cuts deep, huh?
I mean, it cuts deep. It is a precision tool. It's one that can be used in a lot of different applications and also misused if we aren't careful.
Okay.
And we're talking specifically about ministry through change and ministry to the grieving. I don't know what that image of X-Acto knife as the tool in our ministry toolbox. Do you think that fits, or would you go with something else?
Well, I think it fits in many circumstances. I like the idea of a surgeon's scalpel kind of concept with an X-Acto knife. I mean, X-Acto knife implies very precision cutting, so on and so forth. And I think, as we've talked about lamenting, we talked about the book, Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy, and a lot of folks are going through some heavy things. And my experience of seasons like that is that God is doing very specific work, or can do very specific work in an individual's life through those dark seasons, almost like a surgeon or an X-Acto knife cutting away some things that perhaps needed to be pruned away, right? And so when we talk about the ministry and the life of the church with the grieving, with those who are in a dark season, I think it's a necessary conversation, especially as our larger audience here is mostly people who have gone through disaffiliation, and which is a good thing, I think, for most congregations. But I think we run the risk of celebrating the good things without recognizing the grief that's associated with it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? And as we often say, all change is loss, and all loss must be grieved. And so it's just important, I think, pastorally, to recognize those kind of changes in the life of a congregation. And while most folks would say, hey, this is great, right? There may be a segment of the population in the church that says, is it? In that, they don't know what the next thing is. Not that disaffiliation was a bad thing, but there was a level of predictability in the previous pattern of life. And now we're in this kind of this frontier mode, and we don't really know what's happening or what's happening next or who we're working with. Or you understand what I'm saying? So the change that often comes through the life of a church can cause a level of grief or anxiety that people don't even realize and aren't able to name it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So let's talk about that. How do you lead ministry in a time of change and lead ministry in a season of grief? And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, just from your perspective. I have a few thoughts of my own, but what are some of the best practices for leading through a time of change and grief? You are new here at Riverside. Mm-hmm. You're 4 months into this. Your family's 4 months into this. That's a big change.
Yeah.
For you, for your family, for your boys, and for Cindy. It's new for the congregation as well, right? It's positive, but at the same time, how do you lead through that in a way that acknowledges that, hey, this is a little different?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think central to it is truth telling, right? I think that there is, going back to the podcast from several weeks ago, the mature church is not the church without sin; it's the church without secrets. Mm-hmm. And I think being able to name change for what it is. It's good and it's bad and it's ugly and it's anxiousness. And, I think that's at the very center of it. And it's a countercultural, and not everyone will be happy about it. But I think ultimately being able to have all the cards face up on the table and be able to be honest is crucial in those moments. And from a leadership standpoint, being able to model that honesty and model the vulnerability of being honest to create space for other people to be honest. And, if you can be non-anxious in their honesty, because some of that honesty will not, it may come across as disdain for you and your role in all of it. But being able to give people the space to be honest before God and their church family, it exposes the wound to the light.
Which is a necessary part of healing.
That's right.
So I remember early on in ministry, we had some shifting and change in one of the churches I was serving, where a longtime leader in the congregation, he was chair of the board of trustees in this small little congregation, so he kind of did everything: mowed the grass, shoveled the snow, fixed the furnace, so on and so speak. So and he went into some health problems and had to step away from he was like probably late or mid 60s, early 60s, whatever it was, and he stepped away from his work, and he acknowledged that I can't do the work at the church anymore either. I forget what was going on, but he couldn't do it. So we celebrated his ministry and brought a younger guy on to fill the spot. And within a few months, one of the first things the younger guy gave leadership to was the purchase of a new furnace. Okay. And about a month or so after the new furnace was installed, the previous trustee chair called me and wanted to meet with me. And he was just complaining about the furnace and the money and blah, blah, blah. And finally he said this. He's very emotional. He said, "Why is it when things get old and broken down, we just throw them away?" And in that moment, the Spirit said, "David, he's not talking about the furnace."
Yeah.
And so it changed my posture from being, because I was very confused. Why is he so angry?
Yeah.
And then I realized this isn't about a furnace at all. This is grieving.
Yeah.
Right? He's grieving the loss of health, the loss of his role at the church, what he'd had for years, so on and so forth. And I think it's important when you give leadership to a congregation to be able to recognize those seasons of grief, even when positive things are taking place, and meet people where they are and understand that, right? And give leadership to that. So one of the things that I often say to folks, especially during seasons of death and loss, is that that grief is the price we pay for love. Right? And so if you love something deeply, you're going to grieve deeply. And for a lot of folks, this season of change in the local church is a season of grief. They love their church, and they voted to leave, and yet there's change, and they're trying to process it.
Yeah. Well, and I think about especially, someone like Don Adams, right, who was a multi-tour of duty veteran to General Conference.
Oh, yeah. He was a lay delegate. He's a member of our church here at Riverside, lay delegate to General Conference in the 80s and 90s, probably 4 different times.
Yeah. And it's like he invested deeply in not just the local church, but the global church.
The General Church was his deal, man.
And, it is it's a different sort of mourning for him than it is for, most of the people here.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that completely. So, leading through change, leading through seasons of grief, I think listening is a big key to that, right? I think just meeting people where they are. You mentioned earlier being a non-anxious presence. I think that's critical as well. And then circling back to our previous conversation in our podcast about lament, it's important, right? Not everything is roses and candy, and you have to acknowledge that. And so bringing that to the light, naming it, listening to people as they share their feelings around that.
Well, and I think having the courage, when someone is not okay and you say, "How are you doing?" Like, "I'm fine." Like to say, "Really?
Are you really?
Are you really?"
Yeah.
Like, you don't have to be.
Yeah, it's okay.
If you are, that's great, but don't put on airs for me here.
So I think part of the pastoral conversation with the congregation is, we're going to get through it. It's going to, God is faithful. It will be okay. We have to push through where we are currently and figure things out. And we're in this together, right?
Yep.
And so just recognize that, naming it, and being honest with each other about it, I think is critical. Anything else you'd add to that conversation for those folks maybe listening who maybe, I think for some folks perhaps it may be one of those things like, oh, okay, that explains why so-and-so has been on my case, or that explains why I feel so lousy about what's happening right now, right?
We, the treasurer at a former church, there was like a 2-year period where at some of our administrative council meetings, he was just impossible to deal with. And others, he was fine. And about 8 months into this sort of, just wild swings of behavior at administrative council, I started noticing, how much grimacing was involved in his coming down the stairs and getting to his seat because he needed a knee replacement. And, like it was a 1-to-1 relationship. Like if his knee was in pain, we were not going to have an enjoyable meeting.
So you were paying the price for his bad knee.
If he was okay, like if his pain was tolerable, he was delightful. And yeah, I tend to think that's true in just about every situation. Like when there are people who are just being unreasonable and irrational, there's probably something going on that you either don't know about or have forgotten about, but is working there behind the scenes and learning how to be compassionate and not just be like, this guy, like, how can we get rid of him? This is unbearable.
Right.
But recognizing that, just about everyone is trying their best all the time. And sometimes you just don't have enough in the tank to be your best. And learning how to be gracious with folks who are in a spot where they can't be at their best. Or even at their regular.
Yeah. So when you think about what folks in any local church has gone through in the past 3 years, right? At least in our circles. COVID, right? A friend of mine was saying that a lot of the pastoral changes that took place during COVID were short-lived.
Yeah.
Because, there was so much turmoil and upheaval. So you may have gotten a new appointment in 2021, and by 2022 or 23, you were on to another one.
Yeah.
So just a lot of upheaval in people's lives through COVID. And you top that with disaffiliation that has a lot of change in the last 3 years in churches' lives. The loss of income, the loss of membership, the loss of attendance, staff changes, all kinds of things contribute to this concept of grief. And then just the normal things of life, sickness and health issues and death, just pile on top of it. And so I think it's important that as Christian leaders, that we acknowledge those things, give people space to be able to name it and trust God through it, and allow God's healing to come through in the midst of that. Throw on top this concept of lament. It's an important thing to be focused on, to help folks to just name what it is they're struggling with.
Yeah, because ultimately there is no benefit to folks just being like, "Hey, smile, it'll be okay.
Don't worry.
Like, no,
Be happy.
Ooh, 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 ooh. But no, I mean, being able to come alongside someone and give them space to be honest, and then being able to do the truth telling of reminding one another of God's steadfastness and God's trustworthiness, so that you can each experience your trust being renewed, I think is really important.
That's good. I think that's a helpful conversation.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think this wraps up today's episode. Good conversation on lament, heading into the holidays, right? And I like the book that you chose from your library, and good conversation about the Toolbox ministry with those who are suffering and grieving in times of loss. So that's good.
Yep.
All right. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Recovering Methodism podcast. We hope your heart has been strangely warmed. Be sure to like, subscribe, share with your friends, and leave a 5-star review. God bless.
Is there anyone more delusional than a Michigan man? I can't think of anybody. Nor can I. Who have lost their mind more than a Michigan fan, man, band. Most self-righteous, self-important, self-deluded bunch of self-centered turds on the planet. It's totally disgusting.